I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. And this morning, we're going to be returning to a topic we frequently address here at FPRI, and that's great power competition. With a twist, we're going to be talking about it in our own backyard, Latin America. And we have an excellent group of scholars with us this morning. Moderating is Chris Miller, who, if you come to FPRI often, you will know well. Chris is the program director of our Eurasia program. He's also a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And he has two books coming out. One is We Shall Be Master, Russia's Pivot to Asia from Peter the Great to Putin. And he also has another book coming out on the geopolitical history of the computer chip. I can't wait to read those. Also, a couple things to go over before we begin. FPRI, as you know, is nonpartisan, and any views expressed here today do not reflect either FPRI, the U.S. government, or the Department of Defense. They're the personal views of the participants. A couple other things. We've had some commentary from our audiences over the last well, really, especially the last week, but over months, to include maps. So we hear you. We have maps in our chat room. If you open up your chat box, you will see there are links to maps of the area we'll be discussing today, Latin America and the Caribbean. So please, if you want a map, make use of that, and when you give us feedback at the end, tell us if you liked that. We found that was an easier approach than trying to share the screen, which is complicated to do. The other thing to mention to you is that we have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So about midway through the program, we'll be turning to your questions. So if at the bottom of your screen you see the Q&A, click that button and you can add your question there. Again, I'd like to thank our supporters and FPRI members. As you know, we're different from the rest of the media. We go deep. We provide expert analysis and in-depth discussions of important topics of the day. And if you appreciate that, please consider supporting us. Check us out on www.fpri.org, where we have articles, we have videos of past programs. So please come to know us. And again, for those of you who do already, we appreciate your support. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my colleague, Chris Miller.
Thank you very much, Raleigh, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to our discussion today. I'm very excited to welcome two very distinguished scholars of FPRI to join us for a discussion about great power competition in Latin America. We hear a lot about great power competition today, including U.S. relations with Russia and China, and this affects almost every region of the world. And one of the regions that's, I think, less often discussed, but in some ways quite important and interesting, is Latin America. And so our goal today is to dig into how the great powers view Latin America, and also how Latin America is viewing the great powers in response. So not only to understand the strategies of Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, but also how this interacts with the interests of regional powers and countries in Latin America as well. So we've got two scholars to help us sort through this question of great power competition in Latin America, and I can think of two no better people to help us understand the trends at play. Barbara Fick is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and also a U.S. Army colonel, where she serves as director of the Americas program at the Army War College. And Max Hess is a Central Asia fellow at FPRI and also head of political risk analysis and consulting at AKE International, where he's based in London. So I'm going to start our discussion by posing a couple of questions to our panelists today, but I encourage all of our audience members to join in the discussion by placing any questions that you'd like me to pose to our panelists in the Q&A box, and I'll begin picking up your questions around halfway through our allotted hour. And so I encourage you to put your questions in there, and I'll try to pick up as many as I can. But let me start, if I can, with Barbara. Barbara, we've heard a lot about great power competition in every region of the world, in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific. Latin America is, I think, not often seen as a kind of key testing ground of great power competition, but in fact, we've seen substantially more interest from both Russia and China in the region in recent years. Can you help us understand what are the key trends in Russian and Chinese engagement in Latin America, and what's different now than, say, how things were 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, thank you, Chris. That's a really great place to start. And the one thing I'd like to highlight before beginning is that it appears often when you're in circles, the circles focused on Latin America, that we're just seeing this for the first time. But China and Russia, in different ways, has been present in the region for some time. Chinese immigration started in the region, to the region in the 19th century, and there is a very large diaspora in the region, which often facilitates the connections that we're seeing in the current engagement by China with Latin American nations. Russia, as you know, during the Cold War was very active in the region, and they never disappeared from the region, as some may believe, due to the lack of coverage in the news. Going back to great power competition, that's clearly a focus around the globe, and it's, as we're looking in our own neighborhood, and I think it's uncomfortable for people to talk about our neighborhood as a piece of great power competition, as it may well be uncomfortable for our neighbors to be referenced as part of a competition for resources, or a battleground, or a space that greater powers are competing to influence or control. But that's exactly what we're talking about in Latin America, and how it's seen by Latin Americans. So Russia's been there with the Cold War, since the Cold War. They've faded, but they've always kept a small presence. Number of legacy countries, legacy partnerships, relationships, obviously Cuba, Nicaragua, and in some cases, and speaking from a military perspective, defense relationships, legacy equipment in countries like Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and some of that entailed continued relationships for spare parts and maintenance. In some countries, the US has actually been able to work with that legacy equipment to our benefit in terms of training Afghan military on some of the Soviet legacy equipment that was left there. So, you know, there's a long legacy. That's the most important thing of the Russian relationship and the China relationship. More recently, we've seen China and the US has taken it as purely economic engagement, seeking resources for to fuel their large economy, because they are one of the largest, the second largest in the world. So that's completely natural, and we've looked at it in that way. But in the last 5 to 10 years, we've become a little more focused on how that presents more of a threat to the United States, or it's competition, potential for threat. Russia has also become more active, perhaps in the last 5 to 10 years, I'd say 5, engaging more of the nations, and for us, we see a military engagement, sending aircraft to Venezuela for exercises, and building a counter-narcotics training center in Nicaragua, which may or may not be a counter-narcotics training center, and other similar activity. And I won't go into great detail. I'll save it for the back and forth dialogue, because I really look forward to that portion. But quickly, I'll say the US response. In terms of China, our response has initially been, oh, it's purely economic, no threat. More recently, we see the greater concern with competition, or that this incredible economic engagement, the connections, the recent agreements, the turning of many countries from Taiwan to China, the Belt and Road Initiative in 19 countries in the region. This is becoming a little more pervasive. And then as they get more and more into the infrastructure, not just what we've called the debt trap diplomacy, but the infrastructure as well, we have two concerns. One, the political influence they exert over the sovereignty of the nations in Latin America. And two, as they get into infrastructure like 5G, our ability to share and work with those nations, particularly in terms of security and defense, but also even with commercial and proprietary licenses and technology. And with Russia, they've become just a little more aggressive in their engagement in the region, which is what is the concern to the United States. How have we reacted? In terms of China, we've pretty much continued doing what we do best, which is transparent engagement, security cooperation, focus on institutions. I think we could do that better. We haven't messaged as much on that. China has been incredibly savvy messaging on how much they are engaging and doing for the region. And that's an area of concern. Is it all a question of messaging? No. Is China putting a lot of money into their engagement? Yes. Should the United States compete dollar for dollar? No. If we could, if there's a return for that, sure. But I think it's more our people to people, it's more addressing directly the needs of the region, and that's where we could do more. Yeah, I'll pause for China on that, and then with Russia, our reaction, we've enacted legislation for sanctions for those companies that do business with Russia or within the region, and that actually has not played well in Latin America. So their response, as I said initially, is pragmatic. They're going to go for the partner that can provide them the most. Oftentimes, they prefer to work with the United States because of our transparency, but our very transparency, the quality of our engagement and our products from a security assistance standpoint also means we're a lot slower. It's more cumbersome, more bureaucracy, more rules to follow, less opportunity for corruption, quite frankly. So that may hinder some of the cooperation. We also cost more. We cannot offer things at the cheaper prices or for free like China or Russia can. And they're offering because they have other interests in mind. So our response has been to keep doing what we do, but we haven't been messaging enough about what we are doing. Many times we are doing more than the Latin Americans perceive. And I think I'll say just one more thing, Latin American reactions. We have a legacy in Latin America too, a legacy of intervention, a legacy of, go back to the Monroe Doctrine. This is our sphere of influence. And at times we have been heavy-handed and we are perceived that way. So we have to be very careful. I mentioned briefly kind of the stigma of the great game and treating other nations as bones that dogs are fighting over. They are more than a bone. They are our neighbors, equal peers. And I think we have to be very careful when we talk about great power competition that we don't remember that we're talking about peers as well. Yeah, I think I'll end there, and I'll be happy to receive some follow-up questions because I certainly have more that I can talk about.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Barbara. That's an excellent introduction to the dynamics in Latin America. Let me turn, if I can, to Max. And Max, we've heard a lot recently about Russia being involved in Latin America. Obviously, as Barbara noted, it's been involved for many decades in different ways, but it does seem like the involvement has intensified in places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, maybe even Cuba. Can you give us a sense of how Latin America looks from the perspective of the Kremlin, and what are they trying to accomplish in the region? What's their main goal?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, first off. I think when it comes to Russia's approach to Latin America, it does have specific partnerships with certain countries, which you mentioned, in particular Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, which have really sort of diverted from the trend of the rest of its relationship with Latin America. We have also seen some pretty remarkable changes in the relationship with Bolivia over the last 18 months, which used to certainly be in that group. And now it's a question, as it's under its transitional government, whether it still will be. Moscow does, even though they often poo-poo our mentions of the Monroe Doctrine, and after John Bolton, while he was still in office under this presidency, spoke of the Monroe Doctrine in Venezuela. The Russians had some very critical comments of that. And then I think they really realized how weak it was when very shortly thereafter, the U.S. actually sent representatives to go negotiate with the Russians about the future of the Venezuelan government. And I think that really got a lot of people in Russia's attention. Even if their economic investments in Venezuela have not paid off, or at least not yet, they have certainly secured it a geopolitical foothold in the region to a level that it has not had since the Soviet era with Cuba. The Cuban relationship is a little bit on the upswing as well. Russia is investing in some port infrastructure in Mariel. They've increased some trade in recent years as well. Nicaragua is a bit of a different example. In Nicaragua, the Ortega government really itself took the initiative to sort of reach out to the Russians, in part through their recognition of some of the breakaway states after the 2008 conflict in Georgia, and that relationship has really developed there. I share some of the raised eyebrows around the Joint Police Training Center and the questions of whether the real purpose of that is anti-narcotic activity, which, although Russia has problems with narcotics as well, it's primarily emerging out of Central Asia and Afghanistan. And then finally, Russia does also use Latin America as an area to counterbalance with the US. When Secretary of State Pompeo went to Tashkent last year for this Central Asia conference, the Russians very sort of hastily organized trip for Foreign Secretary Lavrov, in which he came around the Americas, including to Mexico, which I believe was his first visit there in maybe 15 years. And there wasn't sort of really a lot secured out of that, at least on the Mexican side. But I think it was, in their view, very much a signal that the more you come into our backyard, the more will come into yours. And then finally, one area that I also think is interesting is its relative cooperation with China in Latin America. Russia and China have been able to accommodate one another's rise in Latin America fairly well. Even in the Venezuelan disaster and the pure amount of investment lost on both countries, which I think is a salient point in China as well, but its first sort of big push into Latin America over the last 20 years, perhaps economically did not pay off. The Russians have also faced their challenges there. My view is the Russians are certainly willing to bank those costs of economic costs in exchange for the geopolitical benefits. How active the discussion is with China about helping balance and support one another's interests in Latin America is a question that I still think remains to be answered, but it does also then help them balance their relations in its own backyard in Central Asia in turn.
Max, you've done a lot of really fantastic and cutting-edge work on Russian financial and economic interests in Latin America, but one of the things that you found is that Russia has lost a whole lot of money in its investments in Latin America. Can you help us understand what role economics and business interests plays in Russian strategy? Are Russian leaders trying to make money in Latin America, or are business interests really a lost leader for Russian strategic interests more generally?
No, so I really view, and this perhaps stands a little bit to counter what some of what Barbara was saying earlier. I really view that the geopolitical follows from the economic, and for Russia and China, even more than having investments that pay specific returns, it's building those linkages that really allows the sort of geopolitical networks to then develop and alliances to be formed. And in some ways, as a foreign country being seen and coming in to take a loss and being willing to take that and continue to do business can be well appreciated by perhaps local elites more than local people in the Venezuelan case, but certainly some of Russia's other investments and China's investments in commodities infrastructure and elsewhere have had some of those same benefits. So I see that it really follows from that, and the Russians have essentially been willing to do it as loss leaders. One more thing that's important to note is the Russian government is not entirely unified in its approach to these matters, and it typically goes, particularly for countries that are further abroad, and has specific firms or business interests kind of take a lead. Venezuela, with Rosneft sort of being the case par excellence, Igor Sechin, Putin's former chief of staff, now the longtime CEO and former chairman of Rosneft, he himself went to Venezuela after Chavez's death to eulogize him. He's traveled to the country far more regularly than any other Russian official has. We've seen some developments of Russian relations through Rostec and GLONASS and the space developments as well as through in Bolivia through its proposed investment, and which is now kind of caught in the tenterhooks of the transitional government, its nuclear research facility that it invested in there as well under former President Morales. So Russia really sort of leans on these companies. Rosneft is certainly the strongest and most exemplary one, but it also essentially operates quasi-independent foreign policies in Kurdistan and elsewhere around the world. So that role is not entirely unsurprising.
Maybe one more question for you, Max, then we've got our first question coming, which I think I'll pose to Barbara after this. But you mentioned the role that Russian state-owned enterprises have played, people like Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft. Should we interpret Rosneft as executing Russian foreign policy, i.e. a foreign policy devised by the Kremlin, or is it more accurate to see Rosneft pushing the edges of Russian foreign policy and actually Russia responding, or the Kremlin responding to what some of its state-owned enterprises are actually trying to do in Latin America?
Sure. So this is certainly by no means a universally held view, but I have long been of the view and remain of the view that Russia's system is overly seen as being entirely directed top-down, with it all being Kremlin diktats. I think there's a lot of different interest groups, economic, security, often overlapping from the economic and security sectors within the Kremlin, and that Putin's actual role is essentially to serve as kind of arbiter between them. Sechin is, however, certainly one of the most powerful. He railroaded the former economy minister, Alexei Ulyukayev, into jail, even after Ulyukayev agreed to his takeover of another Russian company, another Russian oil company. He, in response to some of the media coverage about the recent dealings in Venezuela, where he has sort of shuffled the cards together with the Russian state to make it look like Rosneft no longer is itself holding the interest. They simply just made a new company and named it Roszarubezhneft, Russian Foreign Oil, and parked it in there, essentially through kind of three-card Monte to try to minimize sanctions risk. And I think that there really is an important role to why he's allowed to do these things and how it sort of pokes holes in the sanctions regime. That could potentially be another question. I don't want to go off on a tangent there, but that he's able to do those things, or even, it's hard to say it's directly connected, but essentially helped take over editorial control of Vedomosti, Russia's largest sort of leading business daily, after its critical coverage of him, really shows how powerful he is. He certainly is not first among equals, but certainly one of the most powerful of those different actors within sort of the halls of the Kremlin, who I don't see always as entirely unified as the narrative and the general narrative about Putin and sort of the Putinocracy may be.
Thanks, Max. Barbara, we've gotten our first audience question, which I think is a very good one, about whether or not it's correct to see passivity in American foreign policy towards Latin America in recent years, which has left space open for other powers like Russia or China to assert themselves. Do you think that's a fair assertion or description about American foreign policy in recent years and its relations with Latin America?
I think it is a fair topic to discuss for sure, but I quickly wanted to respond to Max. I do agree with him that the economic engagement is a point of entry for both countries, Russia and China, to build on for increased relations. But I think there's a little difference in terms of Russia, precisely because of the Cold War history. For Latin Americans, is that Russia may be trying to, I can't think of the correct wording, but Russia is pretty much getting in the face of the United States in our near abroad. However, for Latin Americans, knowing how that will bother the United States, to develop a relationship with Russia is a way of asserting an independence from the perceived hegemony of the United States in this hemisphere. So it's a show of independence, sovereignty, whether it's for better or for worse. Just not always, but that is one interpretation. But to the question on U.S. foreign policy, really excellent, because I think it is true. The United States foreign policy focus since 9/11 has truly really been on the Middle East, Afghanistan, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, what's going on now in the Middle East. And if we recall the pivot to the Pacific, we haven't seen a really loud focus on Latin America unless it's drugs or recently the immigration and the building of a wall. So if you look at what we've seen broadcast or communicated loudly as U.S. foreign policy towards the region, it's drugs and immigration, illicit movements. So that does create a perception of not really focusing on Latin America's true problems, though drugs and illicit trafficking, porous borders, all of those things are a part of the problems. But what it really needs in terms of better focus would be the institutions. So I think the question is appropriate and accurate, though I think it's how we vocalized our foreign policy. Has our foreign assistance or just our programming of funds for Latin America gone down with the shift to other regions? Yes. Has it been a shift in importance? Has there been other focus in the region? Yes, but just not as visible.
Maybe one follow-up, Barbara, from one audience member asks whether the U.S. should see Latin America as a priority area vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis Russia. If you had to think about the different regions of the world where the U.S. could devote attention, to what extent is Latin America near the top of that list?
Well, if it were me, that's a different question. But I am a Latin Americanist, so I would put them at the top of the list, of course. However, I would go back to the whole neighborhood concept. This is the hemisphere that we live in. It's not the hemisphere we own. It is our hemisphere, though. We live here. And this is it's kind of, I think it sounds very weak, this idea of being better partners, which I know repeats what we've heard some of our leaders say, being better partners to our neighbors in this hemisphere. I don't think we've figured out how to do that, and quite frankly, I'm not sure our partners in the region know how to take the United States as a better partner, if that makes sense. To trust us, that we're not going to try and take charge and tell them what to do, to trust that we'll treat them as peers. Should Latin America be more important or higher priority? It is our near abroad. I mean, that is the one thing that I think is critical from my perspective. Now, maybe Max would have a different view because he looks at a different part of the world. Is Latin America more important than what's going on in, say, Syria? I think we could focus more resources on Latin America. They are our near abroad. The problems are actually, they're not easy. There are no easy solutions, but they're a little, we share culture, we share a lot of ideology. That's easier. So that's just, it's closer and we share a lot. So we could do more, I believe.
Yeah.
Max, can I turn the question in a different direction towards you and ask about how Russia prioritizes Latin America? To what extent is this a priority for the Kremlin? Certainly we see more activity, but does that make it a priority compared to other regions?
I wouldn't say that it's one. I wouldn't put it at the top of the Kremlin's priority list. No, certainly behind. It's far behind Russia's own near abroad, and Russia also, I think, puts the Middle East quite a bit ahead of in terms of its importance, ahead of Latin America. Africa has recently, over the last even just 18 months, been the focus of a very large push by Russia, by some different interests within the Kremlin halls of power, necessarily than just Sechin himself, who's had so much relative success securing it for Russia in Venezuela, but there's been a similar effort underway in Mozambique that hasn't met with the same kind of success. For China, I think it really is quite a higher priority relatively, at least than it is from Russia. We've seen, I think from China, not only Venezuela, but overall moving into Latin America, and even some of the kind of trade and debt and financing practices that have become so important and controversial around the BRI were really shaped in Latin America, and some potential opportunities for cooperation were missed. China joined the Inter-American Development Bank a little over 10 years ago. The US now, I think, actually personally, rather wisely, is pushing back and trying to assert a little bit more control over the Inter-American Development Bank. But that loss of trust has certainly shaped China's policies around its own moves in Africa and elsewhere, and attempts to sort of set up its own loan and financing infrastructure. The Chinese investments in the commodity sector in Latin America are quite a bit larger. Very quickly, just to sort of respond on the America view, the Monroe Doctrine has been around since a little bit before 50 years. The United States was less than 50 years old when it was developed, and large parts of what are now the United States were actually still Latin America at that time, or at least Mexico in Spanish. So I don't think that is sort of going to change. I think also I agree with Barbara's point about the approach of Latin American countries to Russia, and sort of knowing that it will anger the U.S. And that's why I think it was so unique that Nicaragua essentially intentionally did so. But although the Chinese Communist Party is not really a communist party and the state capitalist one instead, you do see a trend when left-wing governments come into office in Latin America that they do economically integrate and borrow more heavily from China, and that is something that I think is particularly important.
Max, we've also gotten a question on COVID-19 and Russia's position in Latin America, in particular about the Russian vaccine and whether this will have some sort of effect on Russia's relations in Latin America. Can you put that in the context of Russian information operations and political strategies in Latin America more generally?
Sure. I mean, on the vaccine angle, if a virologist or an epidemiologist wanted to comment on geopolitics, I'd be very happy with that. But as somebody interested in geopolitics, commenting on virology or epidemiology is outside of my wheelhouse. We have seen Venezuela and Bolivia and some of the traditional allies agree to do some testing there. Russia has provided some more humanitarian support, but not as much as Maduro was even claiming well before COVID would come that was there. So yeah, it's a little curt, but that's all I can really say on that.
Maybe, Barbara, turning back to you, we have a question on China's trade relations with Latin America, which, as you've mentioned, have grown substantially. The questioner asks whether this increase in trade and economic exchange and investment has led to growing trust in China, or whether, in fact, despite the trade relations, there's still lingering mistrust of China's intentions in the region.
I would have to say that's a mixed bag. The United States has been pretty clear, pretty consistent messaging with the transparency and the trust and sharing examples of the debt trap diplomacy. But on the other hand, and there are countries that are hearing it and are losing trust or don't have full trust in China. But there are other countries that are pretty much tired of hearing that same message, and it's lost its meaning and its weight. So,
if I could just respond quickly. I would say, yes, I think there are countries that are hearing that message. I think that we do risk politicizing it in some of those Latin American countries where the opposition then, which may not be in power right now, then sees it as more attractive. The U.S. legacy of its own debt trap diplomacy in Latin America in the 19th century, and really up until it was kind of abruptly halted under Roosevelt, is quite significant in itself. There's the other sort of negative aspects of the U.S., the School of the Americas training, 11 eventual dictators, which is a record, I think, only matched by the People's Friendship University in Moscow. So at least we have that in common. But when it comes to where the situation is today, I think that in terms of having this conversation and really building it up with the countries that are there, we need to understand the coalitions in power domestically and look at how we can appeal to their interests rather than purely taking it from a geopolitical lens. Whether you have a government in a place like Peru where there's high political instability, but actually relative stability in the key economic actors, balancing those interests and making it clear that the U.S. has been an effective capital markets and investment partner for so long, I think can be really important. Maintaining those kind of relationships in sort of Chile, where there's a lot more Chinese investment, will be really important in sort of saying, I don't think it would be very much in the U.S.'s stated ethos of supporting free markets and investments to say you have to try to ban Chinese investment, or we're banning Huawei, you also please ban China from investing in your silica or copper mines. But rather to say, hey, the Chinese might want to come and invest in things there, and we support that for the potential returns that are on offer for your people, but accepting Chinese rules for those investments, which may well be something that China now in the aftermath of COVID-19 and those quote unquote debt traps that it's able to sort of gain as concessions. That's where we should be really concerned, in my opinion, helping make sure that the institutional order that has regulated, and that ranges both from the Organization of American States to the capital markets, that has shaped U.S. Latin American relations and kept them relatively stable despite occasional bouts of far left and far right governments coming up in almost every country in it, is what is paramount, rather than saying, oh, Beijing, don't accept any Chinese money.
I think those are great comments, Max. And I think you mentioned it. One of the questions mentioned something about the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And, United States needs to support the multilateral groupings and be a part of them. Withdrawing ourselves was almost tantamount to withdrawing from our engagement with those countries. And I personally think that was a huge mistake for the future and for us to be able to deal with the competition with China.
I ask, looking forward over a 5 or 10 year time horizon, we've mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative a couple of times, and one of the audience members asked a question about how will the Belt and Road play out in Latin America. Barbara, you mentioned that over a dozen Latin American countries have signed various agreements with China in the context of Belt and Road. What is it going to mean in practice over the next decade?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we're going to have to watch play out. With some of them, I can't think of the precise example, but China has basically loaned nations the funding for infrastructure projects that either were never finished or were faulty, and the countries are still paying China back for them. That those are just some cases that are out there. Another we've seen just recent, the dam projects, which were part of mining projects in Ecuador and Brazil. The dams were not well built and they collapsed. So we're starting to see, and that goes back to that point of trust of China. And we're seeing where many of these grand infrastructure projects that were to bring more economic opportunity to the region are not only not bringing that opportunity, but they're failing. So, there's just a few examples out there. It remains to be seen how it plays out over the long term. In Jamaica, China built the Cross Island Road, but China gets the proceeds from all the tolls. So they built it, they loaned the money, or they paid for it. I forget in that case. But that eventually will grate on the nations in the region.
Max, I know you've done a lot of thinking about the history of foreign investment in Latin America, and I guess I can't help but draw comparisons, for example, to U.S. fears in the early 20th century that Japan might fund a competitor to the Panama Canal in Nicaragua, or events like that. Is there a chance, do you think, that we're overstating the potential success of Belt and Road in Latin America?
I don't think that it's necessarily so far been entirely successful, but it is on a path that continues to offer many avenues to success. And so, that gets to sort of the point that I was mentioning earlier, saying, if China, it's going to be hard, as Barbara was saying, to compete dollar for dollar. And if China wants to invest, let them, come invest. But, making sure that the infrastructure is not reshaped in a way that really balances towards China is really important. I think we may very well see a lot of sort of the initial battles of where that's going to go over the coming year and a half, with sort of some of the debt restructurings that are being worked out. We just got very recently China doing its own debt adjustments for Ecuador not long after the private, mostly Western, not entirely US, creditors agreed to restructure things. China remains outside of the Paris Club framework, however, which is very important there, but has really, so far in COVID, broadly, and there will of course be examples where it hasn't, but broadly cooperated with the global official financial infrastructure. And I think that that's a potential avenue where we should say, okay, if we can try to talk to China and cooperate more on this, maybe it can be an opportunity. I don't see that happening almost regardless of the election outcome. For example, in the US, I do think on that front, it would be interesting to get more of a concrete Latin America policy coming out of both campaigns. Trump at one point had John Bolton and his very strong ideas, and Elliott Abrams and people who really strongly were advocating for the Monroe Doctrine, but then very much has others who say, America first and let's tariff them. And if you're tariffing those countries while saying, no, don't join, China's investment infrastructure, I think that's a lot harder to do.
Well, Barbara, we've gotten a couple of questions actually focused on the U.S. election, asking whether a change in government in the U.S. would result in substantial change in policy towards Latin America. Obviously, it's too soon to say who's going to win, but if you suppose that a Biden administration does come to power in January, would you expect substantial change in the U.S. approach towards Latin America?
Because I still wear a uniform, I'll be very careful. But yes, I would expect substantial change in our approach to foreign policy. I think it would be safe to assume, since Biden was President Obama's vice president, that we would see some initiatives or some focus that was previously there return, more on the development initiatives and economic opportunity initiatives than we're seeing now. So yeah, I would expect change for sure.
Great. And maybe, Max, if I could turn to you for zoom in on some of the specific hotspots. Venezuela, Cuba, obviously places where there's disagreement between the two parties in the U.S. and the proper approach. How would you imagine that policy might shift if a Biden administration were to come to power with regards to some of those Latin American hotspots?
I mean, on Cuba, I do think, obviously, Trump's, withdrawal from the JCPOA has gotten a lot more attention, but the shift in, U.S. relations to Cuba under Trump hasn't been quite as drastic as Trump, perhaps at certain points earlier in his administration, said that it would be, although we have significantly cut back some of the progress that was, or what I view as progress that was made under the Obama administration. I think the same principle that despite my personal skepticism towards the Israeli, Bahraini, and Emirati deals, at the same time I'm always happy when diplomats are talking to each other, and I think that same should apply in Cuba as well. The issue, and one real bit of the Cuban issue is just because of how important the Cuban American vote is in Florida, which has historically been such a close state. It really, if Republicans do really heavily go Hispanic, there's a big shift in Hispanic Cuban American voting in Florida towards Trump, and that helps him, win re-election. Or I think it's, that will have real political implications, and anyone trying to push for one political path on Cuba or the other in the immediate aftermath of the election the first questions they will get will not be about geopolitical interests, but from the politicians will be, okay, but in the November election this just happened with Cuban voters, and I don't know yet what that is going to be, but they're certainly not going to stop being an important voting bloc soon. With Venezuela, I mean, the Venezuelan crisis has really been is a horrifying humanitarian disaster. And I do agree with Barbara's earlier point that there should be more focus on that, perhaps from a U.S. interest point of view. Syria and the Syrian refugee crisis and the humanitarian crisis and the war crimes and terrorism it's a whole confluence of many things that are very much either displeasing to our values or horrifying to our sentiments. In Venezuela, that we do have a lot more economic linkages than we ever did with Syria. The refugee crisis, I think, that it is precipitated across Latin America is one of those things that we say, okay, the immediate impacts of this don't really affect the U.S. that much, but the second and third and fourth tier impacts, I think, really could affect the U.S. over the long term. And our failure to sort of see those issues with, some of the past, for example, the drug war or the anti-drug effort in Colombia, and so immediately focused on saying, let's kill the drug producers. I think we really do need to have a lot more of that thinking in Latin America, because the chain reactions are always eventually going to ripple down to us because of the economic and economic geographies of the region.
Max, we've also got a question about counter narratives to U.S. diplomatic efforts in Latin America. What's your sense as to how effective Russian or Chinese counter narratives are when it comes to diplomacy in Latin America?
Well, I think this goes a bit to the point that Barbara had brought up earlier about, this sort of, when the Latin Americans go to the Russians, we still see it as, very, perhaps one of the aftershocks of the Cold War, although it largely ended peacefully outside of certain pockets of Africa and the former Soviet Union itself. So, I do think that the Chinese have been relatively good so far about managing that. Now it's really something coming from the U.S. Also, as Barbara mentioned, this sort of, hey, let's push back against China, and how much China is going to counter that, and how much they'll say, hey, the bad northern neighbor that you guys have always had to contend with, how much as we grow into a more openly adversarial relationship with China, which I still think, even under potential Biden administration, would be broadly still adversarial, if not quite as wantonly as it is under the current government. That we may see a lot of change there, and on that, one relative success that Russia has had that has kind of been a model for it elsewhere is the success of Sputnik. It's an RT, but primarily Sputnik, its state-run media and propaganda operation in Latin America. It is, Sputnik's coverage in Latin America is very different from its coverage, say, even in the UK, where it has a very sharp, left agenda. It certainly is broadly left in Latin America as well, perhaps because of the tendencies of those movements there. It has really been able to establish itself in certain markets as sort of a leading media source. And how the Russia, so one thing I'm really interested in, following going forward is also how Sputnik in Latin America, which has local journalists or local authors, is itself talking about China and the cooperation there. And China has, I'm not a Chinese speaker and it's not my area, but has had relatively, from my opinion, at least on the pure media front, less success. But when it comes to Russia turning its troll factories and the like into an actual media operation, or one could make the argument that they're actually separate things, but Sputnik has established itself on that role across much of Latin America, and I think is certainly something, particularly given the U.S. interest in disinformation and media narratives now, one to watch.
We've gotten a question about not a great power, but rather a medium-sized power and its role in Latin America, and that's Iran and its ally Hezbollah. Can you talk a bit about the current state of Iran and Hezbollah activities in Latin America?
Sure. That is one of our third extrahemispheric actors that we look at in the region. There is a large population from Lebanese and other Muslims throughout Latin America. It's a well-established community in Argentina, Brazil, and the Caribbean mostly, and they're mostly Sunni. There's 80 plus cultural centers throughout Latin America. And the main activity that we're seeing are the remittances, zakat, going back over to different groups, coming from the tri-border area, which is a big free zone, free for all, and a lot of money coming out of there, which does end up in the hands of terrorist groups, even if it goes through charity organizations. Tacna on the border with Peru, north of Chile, and Macau, Colombian island, and then of course Colon, Panama, all Margarita Island off of Venezuela. All these free zone areas are generating a good deal of funds that are going back. The Hezbollah financing comes out of some of this, and there's there are groups involved with the trafficking or connected to other trafficking groups, and it does eventually go back. That is something that some of those that were looking at drug trafficking in the tri-border area when I was stationed there, we're tracing money to people in Dubai, excuse me, and then all the way to New Zealand and Australia. So kind of interesting, money and drugs moving from Paraguay, from the tri-border area in Paraguay. So there's a lot going on with that, but it's financing, mostly terrorist financing coming out of the region that's associated with Hezbollah, related to that, and money laundering. The Islamic Development Bank in the region, their finance is 1.8 billion, and I am looking at some notes, and then we're looking at there's some offshore banks also, and maybe Max has this because he looks more at the economics, but I guess the short answer is it's significant from the perspective of terrorist financing.
Yeah, I would. I would say the nature of groups like Hezbollah and the kind of financing and sort of expat and foreign money networks that they rely on is significant for a group like that, but it is not significant for Latin America. The role of Iranian investment is not moving the dial anywhere in Latin, except for in Venezuela, where getting key supplies, key oil supplies. So Venezuela produces a lot of oil, but refines very little, for those who are unfamiliar. So like some other oil producing countries around the world, Nigeria is another famous example. It exports a lot of crude and then imports refined oil. It is traditionally done so from the US, from refineries in the Caribbean as well. The sanctions regime has really helped them stop that. The Russians were providing that support and broadly until Rosneft trading was sanctioned earlier this year. Though, as I mentioned, the Russians have simply shifted their ownership interests of some, domestic assets. The Russians are very keenly aware there that they just need to remain and have a seat at the table, and that they have a very strong card to play whenever the ultimate discussions about some kind of actual future for Venezuela are held, or whenever the status quo becomes so crystallized that it essentially becomes another mid to late Fidel Castro era Cuba. But Iran, certainly, I still think there needs to be a lot of research done. While it has had that relationship there as well, I would not be surprised if that favor also comes with that help for Venezuela is also not met by perhaps an equal favor from Russia, but that somehow Russia has been involved in facilitating that, or in supplying Iran with something in exchange for taking on the risk.
Great. Well, thank you, Max, and Barbara as well. We're at the end of our allotted hour, so unfortunately, I have to cut the discussion here. But I'm glad we were able to cover so much ground, and I think explore the wide array of issues that are touched upon when we look at great power competition in Latin America, from security to economic to diplomatic to informational. There's a large issue set present here, and I think I certainly learned a lot and enjoyed the discussion. So thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Max, for joining us, and thank you to the audience for logging on. If you're not yet a subscriber to our publications or a member of FPRI, I encourage you to sign on to our website at fpri.org to learn more about us and attend our future events. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.